How's everybody this afternoon? Good. That's very good. We're going to keep this very interactive because my wife doesn't like to hear me talk for an hour, and I'm sure you don't want to hear me talk for an hour. But let me just give you a couple of thoughts that we can sort of kick off the discussion. And while you're out there, as you know, as David Sharon said, you're out there doing the Lord's work of, selling goods and services, building a business, creating jobs. You very often don't think about, well, how does policy, public policy, and how does Washington, D.C. affect me? Nor to some degree should you have to think about that, but you need to be aware of what happens in Washington, how it impacts you, and more importantly, why it's important for you to understand what goes on here, and if you think it's necessary, why you should have your voice heard. So, as you've heard, Chamber, we're celebrating our 100-year anniversary this year, and the Chamber's done a lot of great things over its 100 years, trade policy, taxes, regulation, whatever. And after Sarbanes-Oxley passed in 2002, what the Chamber discovered was that a lot of businesses in the United States were beginning to have problems raising capital. So as you very well know, you've got to pay your bills every week, every month. You've got to sign the paychecks. If you don't have capital coming in, it's awfully hard to grow. So what the Chamber did is we put together a bipartisan group headed up by Bill Daley, who was President Obama's chief of staff, A.B. Culverhouse, who was general counsel to President Reagan. They went out for a year, and they came back with two conclusions. One was that for the first time since World War II, we were facing stiff global competition, and that's not a bad thing. That means we need to step up our game and the like. The second conclusion was that our regulatory system was out of date, because if you look at our financial regulatory system, it either dates back to the Civil War in some cases. In most cases, it was actually grounded in the New Deal, but the last time it had been updated was 1975. So if you think about it, you're trying to drive a 21st century economy with the Model T regulatory system. It doesn't really quite work. And then about a year after that, we had the financial crisis. So that sort of leads me up to some of the things for you to start to think about. And that is, when we're talking about public policy, when you're hearing about things like the Dodd-Frank Act, about capital markets issues, those traditionally are nonpartisan issues. There's not a Democratic solution to it. There's not a Republican solution to it. You can argue during the Dodd-Frank debate that it did get political, which in some cases it did. But what you saw with the Jobs Act is that it's all sort of coming back to its historic norm, right? That you had huge bipartisan majorities work on it in the House and the Senate about how do we get entrepreneurs out there and how do we sort of get government out of the way. So what I want you to start to think about, though, is when you start to hear about some of the different policy debates that go on, are your interests even being thought of? Let me give you one example. So right after the financial crisis in 2008, there was a slew of legislation, the Dodd-Frank Act. We also had different bills dealing with, credit cards and all this other stuff. So there's a new agency created, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And one of the things that the Bureau is looking at is, well, how do you deal with fraud issues with credit cards or whatever, and were people given too much credit? And one of the things we went into the CFPB and talked about was, do you realize that for entrepreneurs, the people that are in their garage trying to create a business, very often it's the credit card that's the first, it's your first means of capital, right? So if you start to restrict the use of credit cards, what's the economic impact, right? Is there going to be, a latent impact on job creation, as an example? And if you start to think about it historically, right, 22 out of the current 100 Fortune 100 companies didn't even exist in 1975. And out of those 22, most of them were starting a recession. So if you start to restrict that, if you start to restrict personal loans from banks, what's the economic impact? And when you talk to policymakers, which I do, when you start to talk to them about it in those terms, they've never even considered that. So I just sort of want to throw that out there maybe as a starting point for our discussion of, what are the policies that you think government should be looking at to help you, or more importantly, what are some of the policies maybe that government should be stepping back from that may harm you?